My name is Cyrus Webmontag. I am an Iranian-American journalist. I live in Oakland, California, near San Francisco. I lived for 2 years in Germany, in Bonn, from 2010 to 2012, where I was working for Deutsche Welle English service. I had a radio program called Spectrum, which was about European science and technology news. And I've previously also lived in France and Switzerland, and I have relatives in Germany, France, and other parts of Europe. So I love Europe. I'm looking forward to coming back to Germany for vacation in September, in fact.
Oh, cool. This September.
Yeah. But I currently work for a technology news website called Ars Technica. We are owned by Condé Nast, which also publishes the New Yorker magazine, Wired magazine, Vanity Fair, many other American magazines. I am the senior business editor there, but in addition to writing about business, I also spend a lot of time writing about privacy, surveillance, tech law, tech policy, things like that. So there's a lot to write about, and my time in Germany definitely influenced the types of stories that I cover now. And thank you for having me. So coming as an American, coming from California, we hear a lot about American technology companies. We hear a lot about the American impact on the internet as a whole. And certainly America and California, Silicon Valley in particular, has had a great impact on technological evolution in recent years. It was here, of course, that the internet was originally developed. It was here that many of the major technology companies have been founded. Apple, Google, more recently Facebook, Twitter, and many others. But I think one of the things that unfortunately I think we as Americans tend to do is to sort of forget about other things that are happening in other countries, and we tend not to look at what's going on in other parts of the world and try to learn from them. And so I wanted to figure out, well, what is going on in other parts of the world, and what does the internet look like in other parts of the world? And not only that, but what does the internet look like, in a range of countries outside the U.S.? So as you mentioned in my book, The Internet of Elsewhere, I write about 4 countries, Iran, Estonia, South Korea, and Senegal. And I see these countries as sort of representative as a continuum, a spectrum of connectivity in the world, with South Korea, of course, being on one side, the world's most wired country in the world, and with Senegal maybe not being the least most connected country, but, as a sub-Saharan African country, it certainly has its struggles. Yet, Senegal, as far as the internet is concerned, is doing a lot better than many other of its neighboring countries. And then, of course, with Iran and Estonia being maybe somewhere in the middle. So I wanted to kind of learn about how the internet has played out in different parts of the world. And of course, you could apply this to any country in the world. You could understand, what does the internet look like and feel like in Germany or in South Africa or in Pakistan or in Bolivia or anywhere else. I just happened to choose these ones. Estonia is one of my favorite countries. As my friends and family will tell you, I'm something of a Estonia obsessive. I have been to Estonia maybe, I think, 8 times over the last 10 years. And it was a country that, honestly, before I traveled there for the first time in 2005, almost 10 years ago, I barely knew anything about Estonia. But I first even heard of Estonia, really, when I read a newspaper article that said that in Estonia they had declared internet access as a human right. And I thought, well, that's really strange. What does that even mean? And more importantly, where's Estonia, and what's Estonia all about, and what is it? What do they do there? And I knew that it had been part of the Soviet Union. It had been occupied, but I didn't know anything else about it. I didn't know anything about its language, its people, its history. I could barely find it on a map. And so my first question was, what is going on with this tiny country that I've never heard of? And so I started to do a little bit more research into Estonia. And as I said, I went there. And I started learning about all of these interesting government projects and private projects like Skype, for example. The thing that's powering our conversation right now came out of Estonia. And I learned that Estonia has really had an outsized influence on creating and using its own types of technology. Just to give one example, Estonia is the first country in the world to have national internet-based elections. Here in the United States, many people may remember our election from the year 2000 when we had problems with paper voting. And in Estonia, I feel like we can barely get paper voting right in this country, and yet Estonia already has internet voting. This is, of course, enabled by a digital ID card. So just like you guys in Germany have probably your German national ID card with you, in Estonia they have a similar ID card, but it has a digital chip on it. And people use it they put it into a reader, plug it into their computer, go onto a certain website, and can interact with the government in all kinds of ways. They can check their university admissions, they can pay their parking tickets, they can vote, they can pay their taxes. They can do practically any government service that you can think of is done through what's called this sort of citizens portal in Estonia. And that's something that I think is really incredible. Estonia has made use of this and, to some degree has suffered for it. Some people may remember there was the big cyber attack in Estonia some years ago from Russia. But Estonia really has emerged now as a major player, particularly in Europe, with respect to cybersecurity, e-government, things like that. And it's surprising to me, when I meet people in Germany or in other parts of Europe, many people that I interact with that even know technology or interested in technology haven't traveled to Estonia, haven't considered Estonia, haven't thought about Estonia. And I try to, talk it up as much as I can. It's a really amazing country, and I think that many people in Europe and here, especially in North America, could learn a lot from their experience. Estonia, we have to look back into history a little bit to understand that. So Estonia, of course, was occupied by the Soviet Union during the bulk of the 20th century. But it's important to remember that Estonia, relatively speaking, relative to the rest of the Soviet Union, was actually in a pretty good state of affairs, right? So Estonia had a very high literacy rate. The education was very good. The economy, again, relative to the rest of the Soviet Union, was pretty good. And one of the things that the Soviet Union wanted to do in Estonia was to really encourage the education of science and technology. In the 1970s, I believe it was, the Soviet Union established something called the Institute of Cybernetics. And this was sort of one of the best examples of how the Soviet government really pushed for science, technology, education, and encouraged Estonians to study science instead of studying literature and political science and art and social science and other things like that. And in fact, it's sort of an odd coincidence of history that the very first offices of Skype were held at the Institute of Cybernetics in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. So you had this kind of mix of people that were very well educated with, and by the time Estonia regained its independence in 1991, you had a bunch of people who were very smart, who sort of didn't really know kind of what to do. And when the two founders of Skype, Janus Friis and Nicholas Zenström, actually a Dane and a Swede, in fact, when they were looking for smart, good programmers that they could hire for not very much money, they didn't have to look very far. They just looked to Estonia, and they found a team of 4 programmers that developed Skype, and it's developed into this powerhouse, and eventually, as we all know, was acquired by Microsoft for billions of dollars. So, and Skype, I think, definitely is the biggest sort of Estonian success story. If if here in the U.S., if all startups want to be Google, if all startups look to Google as their model, in Estonia, I think lots of Estonian startups hope to be the next Skype, hope to be acquired for billions of dollars. So Estonia has free Wi-Fi everywhere, and it's hard to sort of understand, especially coming from somewhere like California or even somewhere like Germany, where there is Wi-Fi, WLAN, all over the place, really. But from my experience in Germany, at least, it was difficult to find commonly free, open Wi-Fi that didn't require a password, that didn't require a login. I found in many places, especially in train stations and airports, Deutsche Telekom would have some sort of splash page, and they would want you to pay €5 or something ridiculous to access the Wi-Fi in the train station or the airport. And this is a big shock when Estonians come to Germany or to other places and they're asked to pay for something that for them has always been free. When I first went to Estonia in 2005, I would say 75, 80% of the Wi-Fi hotspots that I encountered were free. And there were a few that charged maybe the equivalent of, €1 or €2 for 24 hours. But those have all gone now. There are no more paid Wi-Fi, as far as I know, anywhere in Estonia. And this was largely due to the efforts of one man, an Estonian named Veljo Hammer, who I write about in some detail in my book. Veljo is an Estonian. There you go. Is an Estonian who grew up during the Soviet period, and when Wi-Fi first started to come out, he thought that this was such a transformative technology that he really encouraged business owners, cafe owners, hotel owners, all kinds of people to put Wi-Fi in their locations, and he thought that this was something that should be as free or as ubiquitous as water, as air, as electricity. He really thought that this was something that would change the country, and he was right. And I think, as you then pointed out, later on, after Estonia developed this digital ID card system, what that now means is that if you are an Estonian, anywhere in the country, if you're on a ferry to Helsinki, if you're on a bus going to Tartu to the south, if you're in your grandma's house in the forest somewhere on one of the Western Islands or somewhere, you can very easily participate in the society in just as you normally would. You can conduct business, you can found a company, you can pay your taxes, you can sign contracts. A key element to understand also of the digital ID card is this idea of the e-signature. And under Estonian law, an e-signature is just as valid as a paper signature. So you can sign documents, contracts, anything like that, and that carries the full force of the law behind it. And in fact, it's worth noting that right now, Estonia is in the process of expanding these ID cards to non-resident non-Estonians. So, for example, you and I, probably within the next year or so, if we want to, can sign up for one of these digital ID cards, even though we're not Estonian and we don't live in Estonia. Right now, it's limited to those two. But that would be really cool, because that would mean that, me sitting here in California, I could access all of the Estonian government services. I could found a company in Estonia with just a few clicks from my computer using this digital ID card. And that way I could take advantage of all of the other services that Estonia has to offer. And I think that that could really transform how people think about, founding companies. Estonia, of course, is a member of the European Union, so they would benefit from the European market and from European laws and all of those things. So, having those two things together, I think, is really transformative. Obviously, the quality of the internet is great. There's no questions on that front. But I think the thing that Germany has to contribute most to this conversation is questions of privacy and surveillance. And within this past year, this has come up more than ever. When I arrived in Germany, it was spring 2010. And just a few months later, many people may remember, this was when Google Street View had first arrived in Germany. And, I was a new immigrant to Germany. I didn't know German society that well, but as a journalist, I found myself writing about Google Street View practically every week for that whole summer, and I saw that Angela Merkel and all German politicians practically were bending over backwards to give their opinion and their commentary on Google Street View and how it was terrible or how it wasn't terrible. I remember there was a tiny town in Bavaria called Oberstaufen that loved Google Street View. That they thought it was great for tourism. They thought that Google Street View was wonderful to bring tourists to see how great their town was. And Google, as you may remember, took the unusual step of allowing Germans to blur their house. So you could go to a special website and type in your address and blur your house. And I thought this was sort of weird because I heard from a lot of people saying, oh, I don't trust Google. They're this weird American company. Who knows what they're doing with our data, all this kind of stuff. But then I thought, well, if you don't trust Google, then why would you go to a website and give Google your name and your address? Why would you trust it then after that? So
Exactly.
that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But I thought that the reasoning was valid. You know, Germany obviously has had a very complicated history over the 20th century, particularly having to do with privacy and surveillance, of course, from both the Nazi era and from the era in East Germany. And I think that it's the sort of German privacy mentality and this sort of data protection laws that have been enshrined in Germany since the 1970s, which is amazing to me, I think is really something that can and should be a standard both in Europe and in the world at large, especially here in the US. I mean, so something that I've been writing about a lot lately is a technology that's called license plate readers. In the UK, they're called number plate readers. They're these specialized cameras. I don't know if they exist in Germany. They probably do. There are these specialized cameras that are on police cars, and what they do is they scan license plates, number plates, very, very fast, right? So typically 60 plates per second. And they scan those plates and they check them against the database of stolen cars or wanted cars. And here in the US, more and more police departments are getting them, even small towns, not just big cities like New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, but even small towns. Where I live here, the police have them. And one of the things that has been difficult for me as a journalist is I'm trying to learn how these license plate readers are being used by different police agencies around my region, around here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the things that I've done is I've filed what are called public records requests. So I've written to these police agencies and I say, okay, can you please tell me if you have any records on my car? And here is my license plate number. And in some cases, they write back and they say, no, we refuse to tell you because we don't think that we have to tell you. We think that this is part of an investigatory file, so we don't have to give you this information. And living in Germany, I'm familiar with this concept of what I think is generally called habeas data, right? The idea that you have to produce the data of somebody, right? Not only for public agencies, not only for police and other government agencies, but companies as well. All Germans have the right to write to Deutsche Telekom and say, hey, please give me my data. I want to see what you have. And you have the right to edit it and delete it as necessary, is my understanding. And you also have the right to do that for any government agency. And this is a right that we do not have here in the United States. And I think that this really changes sort of the balance of power when individuals want to sort of check to see that their data is being used or hopefully not misused, right? And I think that this speaks to a real difference, I think, in the way that Germany and German society, generally speaking, thinks about how privacy should work versus how we think about how privacy should work here in the US. I think the Street View is a good example, right? Here, companies like Google and others, I think generally take the position that we can do whatever we want until somebody tells us to stop, right? Until we get sued, until we get fined, until something happens. Google never asked permission to do Google Street View. Google never asked permission to send out its robot cars all over the place. I would imagine if Google had been a German company or had started as a German company, it would be very different, right? They would have to go to the data protection agency in different states or the federal data protection agency and ask, can we take pictures of every house in Germany? Can we do this? Can we send robot cars driving on the Autobahn or whatever? And I think that that's just a very different mentality. I don't know that one is necessarily better than the other one. I think that sometimes here in the US, we don't generally think of the consequences, I think maybe in ways that maybe German politicians or legal scholars or ordinary German citizens might think about them. And I think that it's important for us here in the U.S. To think about that balance and to understand what maybe our responsibility is, when we're developing these types of technologies. I was only in Germany for 2 years. I was only in a small corner of the country. I was working for a big government media organization, Deutsche Welle. So maybe my experience is a bit different than other people that may live in other cities or work in other types of environments. But I think, if there's one thing that really comes through in the experience of Silicon Valley startups, of California companies in particular, is this idea that it's okay to fail, and it's okay to try new things, and it's okay to allow people the autonomy to explore new types of things. One thing that I experienced working for a large media organization is that there was just a lot of bureaucracy, right? There's a hierarchy of people. Only certain people had certain powers and certain responsibilities. And me, as somebody who was relatively new to the organization, who had not been there a long time, I didn't really feel like I had the power to ask for new things or to try new things. I mean, something as basic as starting a blog for my technology radio show at Deutsche Welle was like pulling teeth. It was very, very difficult for them to do that. And when they finally did it, they wouldn't even allow me to access the statistics to find out how many readers my blog had, or to access the analytics or anything like that, because they felt that that should only be controlled by other people in another department, and I couldn't have access to that. So I don't know if that's true in other large companies or other large organizations elsewhere in Germany. Yes. That was something that I found was a little bit frustrating in my experience. And no country is perfect, no culture, no organization is perfect. But I think that is something that we do generally do pretty well here in the U.S., sometimes with bad consequences, is that we do have this sort of spirit of, let's try it out. I mean, at my current job in Ars Technica, I'm able to explore all kinds of topics. I'm able to learn about, not only write what I want, but to explore, maybe it makes more sense to do a particular story in a video format, or to use a certain type of graphic, or maybe I need to spend a little extra money to get some public records or whatever else. And my colleagues have no problem with that at all. Whereas I feel like that would have been a little bit harder for me to do at an organization like Deutsche Welle. But again, I work now in a much smaller organization. I only have, immediately 20 or so colleagues, whereas, Deutsche Welle much more broadly had many, many more people. So that was something that I experienced. Well, I would say that the conclusions that I drew are that, we as Americans especially need to do a better job of understanding what's going on, technologically speaking, around the world. We need to look to countries like South Korea, Estonia, Germany, and many others. I feel like, if you spend just a few minutes doing some sort of basic research, you can come up with some pretty surprising results. I mean, a good example that I didn't include in the book is in East Africa, in Tanzania and Kenya. A lot of people use essentially cell phone credit as a way to send money back and forth. So just like how many people I had when I was in Germany have prepaid cell phones where they pay a few euros to send a text message or make a phone call or whatever, you can use that essentially as cash. So imagine, sending money to your friend across the country in Dresden, and you send him a text message for 5 euros, and he walks up to a kiosk and shows his phone, and then the clerk hands him 5 euros. That would be amazing if you could send money that way. And this is what people are doing in Kenya and Tanzania. This is a service that I wish I could use here, to have sort of this digital currency in a way that can easily be converted from cell phone credit to actual cash. And that's something that I feel like, here in the U.S. that we just have no concept of generally. There's a few people that maybe have read about it or have experienced it because they've traveled there, but by and large, I think most people don't know about this. I think that, cell phones are another good example. In Germany, you're lucky, like in many countries in Europe, to have lots of cell phone choice. I know maybe you have your own gripes with Deutsche Telekom or whatever provider you may have, but by and large, I found that there was a lot of competition, especially amongst the MVNOs, the sort of off-brand providers like Blau. That was the one that I used when I was there. But I know there's lots of other choices, it was so interesting to me when I first arrived, reading through these websites and reading the reviews of people's opinions of different companies. And here in the U.S., we really don't have such choice, and it's much harder to move from one provider to another. I think that here in the U.S., we're just not aware that, frankly, we're getting ripped off by our mobile providers here. And maybe you feel like you're getting ripped off in Germany by your provider. But I can guarantee you I would prefer any German provider any day over the provider that I have here, just because I paid so much less. And you have this prepaid system that is so common in not only Europe, but in practically every other country in the world, this sort of debit system. Whereas here in the U.S., for a long time, we had this kind of contract situation. And that's starting to change. But what I really want is to have the same kind of service that I had in Germany here in the U.S. I want to be able to debit down and pay for just what I use rather than pay some large amount, even though I may not be using my phone very much. So I think that all of that is to say that it's important to look to other countries and understand how they do business and how they do things as basic as how you move money, as basic as how you use your cell phone, as basic as is your Wi-Fi free or not, and is it easy to access? And then, later on you can get into more complicated things like national elections and, Skype and whatever else. But I think that just being aware of what's happening in other countries, for me, was really the takeaway here, and was the most important thing that I learned. And also understanding, how and why culture can play a role and history can play a role in how these things develop, I think that there's a good reason why people in Germany were more skeptical of Google Street View than we were here in California. We obviously have had different histories and have experienced different things as a community, as a culture, and that plays to what we value or don't value when it comes to privacy and all the rest. Well, thank you everyone for watching. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I know it's a little bit hard when we're talking over Skype, over a delayed conversation, but I'm glad that I could participate in some small way, and maybe one of these days I'll actually show up in person.